Bet Sharukkin, the Son of Perdition, by Alan Bonk. Chapter 5. Thomas Taylor. It was 7 in the morning of August 8th, 1952, when Dr. Stevenson entered the recovery room at Mercy Hospital in Oklahoma City. The night before, he had delivered a baby for a 32-year-old woman named Barbara Taylor. She had been brought in by ambulance. He was there this morning to check on her condition and to give her the good news. After assessing her physical condition and finding her stronger than he had expected, he decided to give her the good news. I thought I was going to lose you last night, but I was able to save you and the baby, both. It doesn't always work that way. Barbara turned to the doctor and asked, "Is it a boy?" The doctor replied, "Yes, of course. I thought you knew." The nurse in the room explained to the doctor that Barbara had only recently woken up and no one had given her the news. Barbara turned to the doctor and asked again, "Are you sure it's a boy?" "Yes, of course. Why? Is it important?" The doctor replied. "Only to me," Barbara explained. "I have 3 children, all girls. Now, I love my daughters very much, but I would like to have a boy for my husband's sake." "Oh, he wants a boy?" Dr. Stevenson asked. Barbara responded, "It's not quite that simple. Tom, my husband, was killed 2 weeks ago in an oil field accident. He worked the rig." "I'm sorry, I didn't know," replied the doctor. Barbara added, "I want my husband to have an heir. I want his name to continue. He was a good man, and he loved God." 5 years later, in the tiny community of Okusa, Oklahoma, the community church, the only church within the town proper, was having their Sunday service. The children and some of the youth groups went to a home 5 houses down the street from the church to have their Sunday classes. The house was bought by the little church to help with overflow. This day was a beautiful late spring day, and the children were playing games out on the front lawn of the house. The favorite game was London Bridge is Falling Down. When the games were finished, the teacher sat all the children down in front of him and gave them a short Bible lesson. It was straightforward and to the point. The instructor explained how Jesus was taken to Calvary and crucified on the cross. He was crucified not because he was a bad man, but rather because he needed to do it for the people who had done bad things. The teacher emphasized that Jesus died willingly, that he chose to die for everyone because he loved the people and wanted them to go to heaven when they die. He was then resurrected to prove that he was the Son of God. Then the teacher asked the children, "Jesus died for you. Will you live for Jesus?" One of the children was a little 5-year-old boy named Thomas Taylor, the son of Barbara Taylor. Thomas was named after his father, who he never knew. Little Thomas's hand shot in the air. "I'll live for Jesus," he blurted out. This surprised the teacher, and he responded, "Tommy, you don't have to tell me. Just tell Jesus what you want, and it's yours." It's all between you and Jesus. Tommy may have been willing, as a 5-year-old boy, to live for Jesus. As it was, he grew into a pretty typical teenager that certainly did not live for Jesus. He and his Okie friends spent most of their time down by the river, fishing and drinking beer. Tommy never ran afoul of the law, but several of his friends had. Tommy was adequate in school, but he never really applied himself. His mother finally persuaded him to put in some effort and bring his grades up. This is during his senior year of high school. He was able to get into a small community college near Oklahoma City. He fell in love with mathematics and engineering, and for him it was a gift. He could see mathematical relationships had effects. For a young man in Oklahoma, the obvious industry for him was oil and gas, as it paid well, and he enjoyed the work, and it would allow him to stay in the Oklahoma area. One night, while he was with his college friends at a local watering hole in Oklahoma City, someone had brought up the subject of the value of going to church. Tom, he's not Tommy anymore, was pretty much a conservative freedom kind of guy. Nothing was more important than a man's right to think and act independently. Big government was the biggest offender, according to most of Tommy's associates. Tom found himself talking about organized religions. While the governments controlled the society, economic and actions, religions restrict or control all the same things as government, except religions go deeper. Religion goes into how people think and their intentions. Religion demanded that the people conform to their set of beliefs or else. Tom's friends just stared at him. They had never seen him so forceful. His comments pretty much brought the discussions to an end. Tom had been driving from school in Oklahoma City back home to Okusa. Every weekend, he would check in on his mom and take care of any jobs that needed doing around the house. It wasn't an extreme drive, but it certainly gave him time to think. This evening, the second trip home since his comments with his friends, Tom had been perplexed by a certain uneasiness in his mind. Every time he thought about what he had said that night in Oklahoma City, he got a feeling that he had offended someone. But who? None of his friends had anything to say or said anything about it. They seemed okay with everything. Tom drove along the 2-lane highway. There was almost no one else on the road. After all, who else goes to Okusa on a Friday night? Then it happened. Tom's uneasiness blurted out. "Leave me alone. Leave me alone." The conflict within Tom's mind had erupted into open shouting in the car. He continued, "God, if you're real, then tell me. If you can't talk to me, then you're not God. I'm not God, yet I can talk. If you can show me that you're real, I'll serve you all my life. In the meantime, leave me alone," Tom exclaimed, frustrated. This was no casual conversation. Tom was crying uncontrollably, with tears flowing down his face. He had to pull over to the roadside to recover his composure before going home. Tom decided not to tell anyone about the incident. He felt sure that they would not understand. He's not even sure that he wasn't cracking up. He told no one. Back at school several weeks later, with the episode in the car behind him, Tom goes on with life as usual, until one of his classmates asked him to go to a movie with him. It was his friend's birthday, and his friend wanted to get away from studies. They went in and endured a perfectly boring film. But as they were leaving the theater, they were moving slowly up the exit aisle. Tom looked up and saw a spiritual vision right before him. The theater had opened up like a portal overhead. He saw two men sitting on thrones in a throne room. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, but he saw them clearly, and he knew who they were. The person in the center was a little higher than the one who was on his right. The one in the center was God himself, the Father. The person on the Father's right was Jesus, the Son. Tom halted in his tracks, momentarily shocked. He then started moving with the crowd around him. He looked at the others who were literally all around him at the time to see if they had seen what he had seen. But they just kept moving forward up the aisle like cattle. He continued to keep glancing up at the ceiling as he walked out of the theater, hoping for a second glimpse of the vision, but it was gone. You might think that Tom would feel excited and elated to know that God is real, but Tom didn't know where he stood. He was afraid that his past actions and words might exclude him from a relationship with God. Tom felt like God had every right to judge him and his sins. After all, he had been indifferent to God's ways and laws. He had ignored God for years and had even spoken against him. But one thing was clear. Tom had promised to serve God his whole life if God revealed himself. And God certainly had done that. Growing up in the Bible Belt, Tom knew where to go to learn about God and Jesus, the Bible. Living in Okusa, he had been around the Bible all his life and never bothered to see what it actually taught. He would dismiss what he had heard as simple stories to keep the kids in line. Now, he was obliged to seriously search things out for himself. He needed to know what God expected. Tom went back to the dorm that night and tried to sleep, but he could not. His mind was racing. After all, his entire world had just been turned upside down. His value system had taken a shot through the heart. Nothing seemed as valuable now as it was before, and spiritual things were suddenly a reality. He reasoned that if Jesus is real, then so is Satan and hell. Tom was terrified at the thought of being held accountable for his sins. For the first time, he felt the spirit realm just outside his senses. Finally, from pure exhaustion, he fell asleep and slept right through his first 2 classes the next day. When he woke up, he decided to skip the other classes and drove home for the weekend. He knew he could not concentrate on something as mundane as calculus. Tom was putting his bag in the back of his car when some students walked by on the sidewalk in front of his car. They were laughing and talking, and then one of the students let out a string of profanity, and the others just laughed and continued walking. The words struck Tom like a slap in the face. He literally jerked around to see who said it. He wanted to shout, "Don't say that. Don't say those things." But they were already too far down the walk. He said to himself, "They don't know what I know. They don't know that God is real. They don't realize that God heard them blaspheme his name." Then he heard a voice call his name. "Thomas, pray for them." Tom was shocked to his very core. Shivers went up and down his back. Who was that? He thought. It was like the sound of a thought, except it wasn't his thought. This thought had come from someone else, from somewhere else. But who? Tom looked around and saw no one else. He then realized that only God would ask him to pray for those men. The voice was full of compassion, not anger. And whosoever it was knew his name. Tears burst from Tom's eyes uncontrollably as he leaned over into the trunk of his car. He had just heard the voice of God. Tom nearly fell down when his knees went weak and he became dizzy like a man with vertigo. He slowly regained himself and began to pray for those offending students. His prayer was simple and direct. He thought that if God can show compassion, he should too. He asked God to open their eyes that they might see. Then he gathered himself and began to drive himself back home. As Tom drove down the familiar two-lane highway, he heard the same voice again. "Thomas, pull over." He looked for a place off the edge of the road, stopped, and asks, "Yes, Lord?" "Thomas, I have been talking to you for years. Every day I have called to you. The problem wasn't whether I can talk, but whether you can hear. You have been my son since the day on the church lawn when you said you would live for me. Not one day have you been alone. You have ignored me, but I have been with you." Peace flowed through Tom like a river. All his fears melted away. From this time on, Tom was a changed man. He saw everything differently now. It was as if he had never really seen anything before. He saw and felt differently about people. He could see the superficial way people acted and their fears. He spoke to them with compassion and guided them to the truth. He would study the Bible every moment he could. He began to learn all the doctrinal truths that he had spurned in his youth. Tom finished his engineering degree because the Lord told him it was necessary. But he wanted to go to Bible college and to learn the deeper things about God. He went to Bible college, but he had difficulties because the college was designed to train pastors. And he did not feel that God wanted him to be a pastor. He still learned how to properly study. Systematically, God showed him that his gift was in the area of prayer and intercession. He also had a keen interest in end-time prophecies, those which speak of future events and things that are yet to happen. Tom has worked for years now in the engineering business and is well respected by his peers. His work was accurate and complete. At one point, he had just finished a large multi-year project. His employer was waiting for another large project to start. His company had decided to furlough Tom and some others in his work group. He was placed on paid leave for 5 full months. Tom was able to immerse himself all day to studying prophecy. He studied all the prophets and their books, every word, every reference. He researched word meanings and charted all their findings. With the Lord's help, he was seeing things that he had completely missed before, making connections that clarified many of his questions. His personal understanding of the prophecies and their implications became clearer than ever before. These 5 months turned out to be an opportunity of a lifetime. Tom soon found out that just because something he has studied seemed clear to him, it doesn't mean others will also see it the way he did. Some teachers and professors were quick to affirm his findings, some were not. They weren't harsh or unkind to him, but they told him to keep his findings to himself for a while, and they would have to wait and see how they would develop. Tom remembered what his teacher on the lawn had told him years ago. "Tommy, don't tell me, tell Jesus. It's between you and Jesus." But Tom isn't 5 years old anymore. He wrote it all down in books and charts and in everything he can, and taught anyone who would listen. Tom lived and worked in Oklahoma City until 2014. His mother had died in 2004, and his youngest sister, Mary, was taking care of the family home in Okusa. Tom, now 62 years old, had prepared to retire. He wanted to go home, and so he made arrangements with Mary to take the house and to live there on his own. He spent the last year renovating the house. He made himself a study and a library that anyone would be proud of. He had a retirement party at his office. The company was particularly generous to him. When he left, of all the gifts that he received, the one he liked the most was a specialty pen, which was carved from exotic wood and had his name engraved in the shaft. The pen came with additional ink replacement cartridges. It was simply a beautiful pen, and it made a thick jet black line. He used the pen to write nearly all his works, papers, and manuscripts. When Tom returned to Okusa, he found that the community church had a new pastor named John. Tom went over to the church to meet him. He was pleased when he talked to him. This young man had a deep and sincere love for God. He also had a love for God's Word, specifically prophecy. The more Tom talked to Pastor John, the more he understood that this young man had a deep understanding of the things of God. The two became prayer and study partners. Pastor John was a great communicator and soon had the little community buzzing at the imminence of the Lord's return to collect the dead in Christ and those who are alive and remaining on earth. John was willing to put his reputation on the line for his convictions. There was a true revival taking place in Okusa. The Holy Spirit honored the prayers and did great things in this little community. In the church, entire families were being touched and brought to the Lord. One of the areas of prophecy that Tom had been following closely was the coming of an Assyrian man who would become a world leader. He would be a man of peace early in his career and then later become a dictator. With the advent of the internet, Tom was able to look for a man that might fit the biblical description. Tom began to follow things about the coming new Assyria and the man that will lead it. One afternoon, Tom had just finished praying and was preparing to study when a news flash came on the TV news channel. It said that Damascus had just been destroyed by an attack from Israel. The details were sketchy, but the attack had indeed happened. Tom stood to his feet, moved to his computers. He turned them on and started searching for more news. He knew what this attack meant. It meant that the Lord's return would happen very soon. He took his favorite pen and began writing notes as the information became available. He took a chart that showed the next event to be the resurrection of the dead and the living believers. He took his pen and drew an X on the diagram and wrote, "We are here." Thomas set his pen down, bowed his head, and began to pray. End of chapter 5.